Music in the American South in the 19th century has been little understood until recent years. As Dr. Candace Bailey has shown, this musical culture was shaped in significant ways by women who participated in music making in both the public and private spheres. Dr. Bailey is a musicologist and professor in the music department of North Carolina Central University in Durham. Her work evaluates the intersection of art, society, and women's lives in the Antebellum period, Civil War, and Reconstruction, significant moments in American cultural history.
When musicologists tell the story of music in Western culture, they tend to go composer by composer or more broadly style by style. And that's fine, except for it leaves out many different aspects of music. And my interest is in women's participation in musical culture. I go about interrogating this topic looking at microhistories of women in the 19th century South in the United States. I have found that these microhistories teach us much more about how music happened in this period. It teaches us how people reacted to different types of music, what types of music they knew, and the role of music in women's lives, particularly the role of music in class, structure, and broad implications for what was going on in the United States during the 19th century. The two women I will be focusing on are exemplary in numerous ways. First, no one knows anything about them, or very little about them, because they were women who worked in music. They were not composers. On the other hand, during the middle and late 19th century, these women were institutions in the cities in which they worked. They broke many boundaries and brought a lot of music to residents of Mobile and Charleston. And it's for this reason that I think their lives are important and for what it teaches us about how women musicians were regarded both before and after the war. It changes significantly in the 1860s. And it illuminates aspects of music history that we don't typically talk about.
One woman who left a significant impact on the city in which she worked was Hermine Barbot. Barbot was a leading figure in the musical culture of Charleston, South Carolina. She was a trained concert pianist and performed regularly, and she also contributed to Charleston's musical scene by teaching music, serving as a church and cathedral organist, and organizing amateur community musical events such as operas.
Hermine Barbot was born in 1842 in Brussels. She and her parents moved very quickly to the United States, but not before her talents as a child prodigy, she was a pianist, were recognized, and she performed before, among others, the King of Holland. She also performed at Niblo's Garden in New York when they arrived, and she apparently accompanied Adelina Patti when she was 10 years old. Her playing was commended by Mary Pleyel and Sigismund Thalberg, two well-known European pianists. In fact, there are two letters that have survived by Thalberg written to Hermine's mother, Marie, talking about her potential as a pianist for career, a touring concert pianist. They settled in Charleston in the 1850s, and her mother opened a school for young ladies. Her father, Victor, taught solfège at the school. He died in the 1850s, and Hermine was forced to undertake his role in the school and give up her career plans as a concert pianist. And this was very typical of Southern women's upbringing, in that they were to please others and do for others is their strongest point. But Hermine goes further. While she is teaching at her mother's school and also an orphanage in Charleston, she takes up positions as an organist in town. She's Catholic. She plays at the Catholic Cathedral and also at St. Mary's on Hassel Street. And it's here that she begins to make a name for herself that differs from the way women musicians worked before the Civil War. She becomes involved in large-scale productions, particularly of oratorios, but according to her obituary, operas and cantatas as well. And she is applauded for being the organizer and director of these performances as early as 1868. Matter of fact, the Charleston Daily News talks about her Christmas Day performance in 1868, remarking that Madame Barbot and her assistants put on a remarkable program that included various pieces by Haydn. What's striking about this is that her assistants would have had to have been men. In other words, she was directing men. She was telling men what to do. This was highly irregular in the South in the 19th century. Women were completely subservient to men, and to have women in charge of putting on these large-scale productions was unheard of before the war. I think it's a sign of what happened with women, gentility, femininity, the way women could preserve their gentility and still take on these new roles that the Civil War had forced many women into, and it became acceptable after the war for them to maintain these positions, at least for some time. In the case of Hermine Barbot, she puts on pieces such as Rossini's Moses in Egypt. Haydn's Creation is a perennial favorite, and other works that exemplify sacred music in Charleston at this period. According to her obituary, she also did operas, and I don't have a lot of information about which operas she did, although I know that she was described as the directress of Donizetti's La Fille de Régiment at a performance in the 1870s. So for her to have been the child prodigy pianist, having to start teaching solfège at her mother's school for young ladies in the 1850s, to rise to a point where she is the directress of such works, including directing the male roles and the orchestra, really speaks volumes about women's agency in music or through music in Charleston in the 19th century. Her obituary says that she was the best of wives and mothers, but it also notes that her marriage did not interrupt her music. And a 19th century biographer also wrote of her that her marriage did not interfere with her musical activities. And I find this very interesting description of Hermine Barbot because it really positions her music as more important than her marriage, but also maintains that balance between woman, marriage, motherhood, and professional director, organizer, conductor perhaps, although probably from the keyboard. Her piano skills were described in the late 19th century as she was a brilliant pianist with a fine technique, with great force, which is a very masculine description, but also with delicacy of expression, which could be a feminizing description of her performances.
Maria Kowalewski and Fanny Sands were members of the impactful civic group known as the Mobile Musical Association. The female members of this group participated in performances and held subsidiary leadership roles. Sands was an organist performing at the Catholic Cathedral. Maria Kowalewski held a more prominent public place in Mobile musical circles as an organizer and director of large-scale musical events, including both operas and oratorios.
Another interesting woman whose impact on her local community was far greater than scholars would have us believe women were is Maria Dillon Kowalewski-Pertz. She was born sometime between 1810 and 1813. Her age differed from census to census. She was born in Dublin. She was recognized as a child prodigy on keyboard instruments. She played the organ and the piano. She became organist at a church in Dublin by the age of 12, and she was noted for her sight reading and transposition skills. Sometime before the age of 20, she married Captain Piotr Kowalewski, a Polish captain. The marriage was not particularly successful. At some point soon thereafter, her husband left and came to the United States. He did not bring her with him, but she and her mother followed soon thereafter. By 1838, the family are living in Pensacola, Florida, where Maria and her mother are running a singing school. By 1845, Pietro, Maria, her mother, and their 2 sons had moved to Mobile, Alabama. In Mobile, she became involved in teaching music lessons, as she had done in Pensacola. Her husband and she grew apart, and in 1850, she was granted a divorce. Divorce was highly unusual at this time. So, for Kowalewski to have separated from her husband in this way is something that shows, I think, part of her independent character. The sons, of course, would have to go with the father. Kowalewski supports herself during these years by teaching piano lessons, and one of her students, Miss E. McCord, dedicates the Hollywood Waltz to her in the 1850s, in 1852. In 1859, Maria Kowalewski is one of the founding members of the Mobile Music Association. It is run by men: Joseph Block, who's a music seller, publisher, and leader of the local band; Samuel Schlesinger, who is one of the first people to publish music for the Jewish services in the United States; and other professional musicians, as well as several amateurs, including Dr. Lingen, Dr. Goss, and Fanny Sands. After the Civil War, this group continues to put on musical performances. And in spite of the fact that men are still the only people who can vote on office and hold offices, Maria Kowalewski seems to have taken over the running of the organization. She is described in a local newspaper in 1868 as having revived the summer evening concert series, and she is programming more instrumental music, which is a step beyond what women were doing. Most of the time, instrumental music is performed in public by male musicians. There were very few female musicians in public performances except for keyboard players. She also is described in 1870 as being the person who is credited with the artistic and financial success of a performance of Flotal's Marta, and the newspaper review describes the flawless chorus and the neat, smooth, and precise orchestra, and she's the person who is directing it. She, like Barbot, is leading men. She would be in charge of telling men what to do as early as 1870. Very unusual for a Southern woman to have this sort of control and this power. Even if it's just in a performance, it's also in the rehearsals and all the constituent parts that come together for a performance.
Descriptions of Barbot, Kowalewski, and Sands in the media played a pivotal role in how they were viewed by the public. Writers often portrayed performances as graceful and dainty, but lacking in substance.
Fanny Sands is described in the newspaper thus: Madame Sands should be proud of her success. Her case is but another one of those who once reveled in wealth, ease, and luxury, but are now forced to toil for home and comfort. Music was her delight. Her devotion to her church caused her, when rich and independent, to volunteer her services as organist at the cathedral. Her mansion was the gathering place for the best of musical talent. She lost her husband. Like thousands of others, she lost her property and was reduced to her own personal efforts for her support. She did not stop to cry about it. If she did, no one knew. She had a fond mother to care for. Like a true, courageous woman, she dashes away the bitter, disappointed hopes. She takes up music as a profession, and this is her debut. May her spirit encourage others to do likewise. God bless you, Lady Sands. This is a fascinating description of women's position before, during, and after the Civil War. Before the war, she's in a mansion. She is wealthy. She volunteers her musical talent at the church or at the cathedral. But she loses her husband during the war, she loses her fortune during the war, and she takes up music as a profession. It's also important to note that the newspaper is praising her work in print. In other words, she's not hiding behind it, but they are talking about her work, her career, her making money with such high praise in the public press, in the Mobile Register. Now, she unfortunately dies later in the 1870s, and Maria Kowalewski puts together a commemorative performance of Mozart's Requiem for Fanny Sands' funeral in 1878. The next year, she puts on more concerts. Like Barbot, she becomes an institution directing large forces of oratorios, operas, and other concerts in Mobile. Her obituary describes her as the architect of her own fortunes. Again, this is high praise for her independence, for her ability to support herself, for her impact in Mobile and all of those who were involved with her. We can see with both Barbot and Kowalewski a change in the way that women are described in the press and the accord given to them by looking at the mere advertisements for their musical experiences. There's a very illuminating advertisement for one of Barbot's performances, Moses in Egypt, from 1885, that includes a lot of white space, particularly around her name. This is an indication that she is the important person. No one else is mentioned by name, and she is highlighted with all this space around her name. Similarly, we can see Maria Kowalewski self-promoting her own musical lessons, her music lessons, in an ad that she placed in the paper in the 1870s, in which she describes herself as professor of music. Women were rarely referred to as professors of music. However, after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, we see Maria Kowalewski taking her own self-perception and projecting it to the public with an ad that says she is a professor, and it too is surrounded by a lot of white space.
For female musicians, the issue of whether to change their surnames upon marriage was emblematic of broader questions related to their public image and their conformity with expectations of domestic life.
When it comes to the women such as Hermine Barbot, or I should say Blanche Hermine Barbot, she is always referred to as Madame P.J. Barbot in the newspapers, so I keep it with Barbot. Kowalewski's even more complicated. She's born Maria Dillon. She marries Kowalewski, and after the divorce, she is still shown in the Mobile City Directory as Mrs. M. Kowalewski. Her student dedicated a piece to Madame Kowalewski. She married again in 1859 or 60, and she married Nicholas Pertz. Pertz goes missing in 1863, presumed drowned, and she is referred to the Kowalewski-Pertz name often in the newspaper, but it's not consistent. So I find it convenient to refer to her by Kowalewski. Kowalewski, of course, sounds more exotic than Dillon, and people in the United States were very aware of how names sounded when they wanted to promote themselves. And so I think Maria Kowalewski kept that last name in part because it did sound like the European that she was, and it represented perhaps a higher level of musical training. Were Barbot and Kowalewski singular cases, or did they represent a trend in any way? It's important to know that in spite of the fact that several modern authors have posited that there were no women organists or very few women organists or church musicians paid in the United States before the end of the 19th century, my research has found that there were quite a few, that it was indeed somewhat regular for churches to have women as paid musicians during the Antebellum period. These can be in tiny towns or in cities such as Charleston or Richmond. It depends if the church or cathedral is wealthy enough to have an organ. Most of them would have been by Henry Erben. Then we find that women very frequently were the organists. They weren't the only people who were organists. Certainly there were many European men who came to play the organ, but there were quite a few women organists in the South before the Civil War. In Charleston at St. Michael's Church, there was a soprano who led the choir. Now, the choir only had 4 people. That was a very typical situation in Southern churches. But she was still the lead soprano and was paid $150 a year, which was a lot of money to be just the soprano in the choir in 1830s, 40s, 50s. So I don't think that they are anomalies. Whether women were able to mount such large productions as they were after the war is something that needs more work. I suspect that if we were to look at, say, Richmond, Savannah, several other places, we might find similar situations. We have pretty good records for Savannah, and I haven't found that women were quite as active there. Of course, it was a smaller town, but I think if we searched, we would certainly find many more. The thing is, we haven't searched. We haven't looked for these women because people writing, even within the past 20 years, have said, oh, well, they didn't exist, so we haven't bothered. And lo and behold, they did exist. And I think further work will find more information. Microhistories of women musicians and women in general in the 19th century provides us with an entirely new understanding of how music functioned in the culture here. It also allows us to see how women used music in their normal everyday lives, their activities, the place of music within culture. It will allow us to see how music works within class and many other aspects of music history that we begin to see when we get away from the composer-driven narrative.
Consideration of the contributions of Barbot, Kowalewski, Sands, and other women artists elucidates an aspect of American cultural life during the pre-Civil War period that has been little understood until now. By exploring these neglected stories, we can achieve a richer and more comprehensive understanding of women's contributions to the musical landscape of the antebellum South.